I got you with the title. I promise this is not just going to be old man doesn't like what the kids are doing these days and wishes they'd get off his lawn. But it's also not going to be academic linguist tries to convince you that anything goes and everything is fine and nothing matters. There's a lot of that going around too, and regular viewers of the channel will know that I am deeply annoyed at my colleagues' tendency to piss on your leg and tell you it's raining. So I'm going to make another claim that sounds spicy. Gen Alpha slang is stupid. And that's okay. I'm a millennial, and ours was too. That second part is really important. Yes, some slang is stupid, but that's okay. So I need to talk about what exactly I mean because it's not what you think. All slang is, to a large extent, based on just not understanding stuff or intentionally doing stuff wrong. Scare quotes very much intended. These are pretty much the two pathways for making slang. So today I'm going to talk about what slang even is, how it happens, and whether Gen Alpha slang is Sigma or Mid. I'll have a word-by-word explainer of most of the purportedly Gen Alpha slang you're likely to hear at the end, so stick around for that if you're interested in it. I'm Dr. Taylor Jones, and this is Skibbity Jones. I'm just kidding, this is Language Jones. If you're watching this, you've probably seen one of those videos where they ask some white 10-year-old about life and the kid just spews gibberish.
The drip wasn't as good, probably like mad lit on gawd.
You don't need me to tell you that every generation has their own catchphrases and slang that they use precisely because old people, I guess that includes me now, don't. Or at least they think that old people don't. More on that later. But what's going on when a child explains that rizz is when you're look maxing? Well, first we have to define what slang even refers to because we are very much not on the same page about that. Then we can get into where it comes from, how it works, and what should be done about all these skibbity kinderlich, pardon my French. First, there's not a great linguistic definition of slang. There's dictionary definitions, but linguists don't all really agree, and dictionaries just describe how people use the word anyway. They're descriptive, not prescriptive, and they're usually very late to the party. The important thing I want to say here is that the word slang is used to describe way more things than it should be. So as a linguist, I'll say that for the purposes of this video today, we can define slang tentatively as words and phrases that come into vogue among a subset of the population which they may use as signifiers of identity, whether it's age group, race, sexual orientation, or whatever, and they eventually fall out of fashion because people are consciously aware of their use. Slang is what linguists would call marked. People notice it. What it isn't is different dialects or how different social classes or ethnic groups speak, but those often get conflated. So just so we're clear, if you take something like Black English, it's an entire set of interlocking systems, and it has its own slang. But what makes Black English or Appalachian English or Yiddish English or whatever a dialect and not slang is that they all have phonological patterns that affect the pronunciation of every word. They all have their own syntactic rules with different grammatical patterns, and they're fully interlocking systems, most of which work below the level of consciousness for most people. We're not usually aware of it. That lack of awareness actually helps create slang words, as I'll explain in a minute. So slang is something people are sort of self-conscious about using. Sometimes it sticks around and becomes a permanent feature of the language, like cool, which started as slang in Black English in the 1930s and was picked up by the white mainstream in the 1950s. And sometimes it gets really popular and then people drop it completely because they think it's old hat, like dig, which comes from the same language variety at the same time, possibly originally from a Wolof word meaning to understand, but now it's only used as professional jargon by jazz musicians, you dig? And there's different ways that slang comes into being, but almost all of them come from misunderstanding something somewhere along the way, or intentionally choosing to break stuff. Let me explain. First, a lot of language change comes just from noise in the signal. Linguists are really careful not to speak negatively of people, and we tend to talk about languages like species that change. But ultimately, the way language changes most of the time is that kids don't quite get something. We don't think about it that way, but it's effectively somebody somewhere was a little slow on the uptake. So phonological changes happen because kids approximate how the speech communities they're born into speak, but kind of sort of slightly miss the mark. And eventually entire generations might just not make distinctions that their parents do make. There's a vowel merger slowly spreading east across Pennsylvania while we speak, where kids just don't differentiate between two vowels that their parents do. Leave me a comment if you know which vowels while I sip my coffee. And the same happens for words. We have fancy terms for it in linguistics like analogy, but it's really misunderstanding and running with it. Let's see how this works with some real slang. Take a word like drip. Now it means fashionable attire, usually a sort of crisp but casual look. This is just analogy happening over and over again. Start with a metaphor like dripping with finesse, meaning you have a lot of finesse, so much that you're saturated with it. This is not new. Baby boomers say things like dripping with condescension, or dripping with class, or dripping with charisma, or dripping with finesse. On the whole, these are positive, not the condescension one, but you get the idea. So given a ton of expressions that use that dripping metaphor, it's pretty easy to get something like, I got that drip, where it ends up being a certain je ne sais quoi that dégoûte. Pardon my French. You're more likely to hear that kind of wordplay in black communities, but that's not always the source. From there, it's very easy to make the jump to drippy clothes, which constitute the outward markers of that drip, and finally to just having drip, which then gets reanalyzed as nice clothes specifically and nothing else. That is, not the rizz that often accompanies drip. If you were paying attention, and most of us weren't, that happened in real time in the last 10 years, helped along by not one, but two hit songs that make use of that metaphor. And for the last 10 years or so, people have been using drip in ambiguous but positive ways, and everybody just has to figure it out from context clues. No surprise, it's now come around to something concrete and tangible. Second, regarding the breaking things, linguists sometimes call this anti-language. The classic example is the word bad, meaning its antonym good. There's a ton of reasons people might do this, and anti-language crops up over and over again. Lots has been written about anti-language and New World slavery and the cultures that came out of the resistance to that, but effectively that's how you get good things described as bad, sick, ill, dope, and so on. It's also how you get funk. There's also another kind of misunderstanding I didn't mention before, which comes in two flavors, both of which are forms of what's called the recency illusion. Basically, if it's new to me, it must be new. So when you Google Gen Alpha slang, you get Stan, defined as an avid fan. One problem, this comes from a song by a Gen X rapper born in 1972, and the song was popular in the year 2000. I get that the person writing the 50 Gen Alpha slang terms you need to know article that's sitting at the top of Google's results isn't American and wasn't born yet, so she doesn't remember the absolute ubiquity of Stan, but the origins of things just get collectively memory holed in general. The spicier version of this is that things different ethnic groups have been saying for years, sometimes literally centuries, are attributed to little white teenagers. Apologies, Aiden, but you did not invent the word clout, and it has meant personal influence since 1946. Low-key has been around since 1895. Chuggy you can have. So every slang explainer is riddled with words that have existed in other dialects for a long time, or just in academic English, but that people encounter a few times and begin to use, often wrong. I'm talking finna, I'm talking extra, which my ass got called in the early 90s. I'm talking lit, I'm talking low-key, I'm talking sus, I'm talking simp, which again you can hear in hip-hop from 1993.
I simp. Damn, I wish I wasn't such a wimp, cause then I would let.
Pretty much if it's actually slang and black people are saying it now, you're going to hear it from everybody in the world, quite literally, in about 20 years. It's like clockwork. Remember when Bye Felicia got big in 2014? That was the 20-year anniversary of Friday. It's not all from African-American speech, though, don't get me wrong. The Beach Boys were talking about good vibes in the 1960s, but Gen Alpha thinks they invented vibes, vibing, and vibe checks. I saw sleeper listed as Gen Alpha slang, explained as something that is unexpectedly good or impressive, often used to describe underrated or overlooked items, experiences, or people. Great. Except it's used with that meaning in a June 19, 1948 issue of Billboard magazine talking about a sleeper hit. It's not just kids and amateur lexicographers who miss these things, linguists do too as well. Geneva Smitherman has an excellent book on Black English, but she incorrectly attributes diva to Black English and not, Italian. And don't get me started on her explanation of Bogart. Humphrey is not included. And a ton of Gen Alpha slang is from games and computing as well. I would have said video games, but honestly, Dungeons & Dragons is punching way above its weight. Maxing, as a suffix, as in he's looks maxing, comes from maxing out your stats on a given parameter. Now it just means doing or being something to an extreme.
Mewing? What's mewing?
It's when you look max.
And that brings me to another driver of slang. There's a pattern that goes by a bunch of different names in linguistics, but I think of it as all variations of the same thing. Jespersen cycle, the euphemism treadmill. Basically, something isn't thought of as being as intense as it once was, and the whole system shifts. Jespersen cycle is when this happens to negation, and it's how you get French moving from ne as negation to ne plus verb plus pas to just pas. If you're studying French, I don't care what your textbook says, people barely ever say ne now. That's how mid now means bad and not middling. If it's mid, it's not good, and what's not good? Bad. Sigma is a double misunderstanding. First, you have the old wolf bullshit about alpha males, where alpha is the best and beta is subordinate to alpha, and so on. This is debunked bullshit fake science about wolves in captivity and is not at all reasonable as a way to think about people, but we'll set that aside. In statistics, sigma is used to indicate the standard deviation. Get it? S for standard? Anyway, back in the day, you might have heard people talk about, say, a 3 sigma event, something very unlikely. Pension does this in Gravity's Rainbow, so it's not super new. Misunderstand all of that, and when you go to intensify alpha instead of super alpha, which mixes Latin and Greek, or hyper alpha, you get people saying sigma.
Also, what does sigma mean?
It means the alpha.
It started with ridiculous influencers online doing the "if men were wolves, I'd be the pack leader" thing, but on steroids. Now it's diffused out from there and just means generically very good. This is also how you get slay, when jazz musicians have been saying something good is killin' for decades. Anti-language, you killed that, means you did it very well. You completely dispensed with the task. But now we have to intensify it. You bodied it. You slayed. You don't have friends. You have a squad. Music was funky for a while, and then you get a tune like Filthy McNasty. Add to this mix baby talk, what linguists call hyperchoristics and clippings and truncations, and you get things like rizz from charisma and delulu from delusional. While I'm on delulu, let's talk about Karens. People have used stereotypical names as stand-ins for kinds of people for way longer than a lot of people assume, including some linguists I know. So Karen and Stan and Chad are familiar contemporary archetypes, but when I was growing up, there was Shaniqua and Becky. Becky's like Karen's mom, I guess. And my parents' generation could refer to gay men as Bruce. And musicians in the 1940s talk about Jack and Mo, and Cab Calloway was calling lames Jeffs in the 1930s. By the way, he was also calling things groovy. Sorry, boomers. Second to last, there's also just changing parts of speech by analogy. Fire went from a noun to an adjective. Flex went from a verb to a noun. But if you think about what you're doing when you're flexing, usually posing to show off, you can understand what a flex is. My age and upbringing would call it stunting on someone, but it's the same idea. Finally, you get to honest-to-goodness, genuine, made-up slang words, and I can really only find about 3 or 4 of those for Gen Alpha, and I'm not convinced that Gen Alpha had anything to do with 2 or 3 out of them. Shoogie, fleek, and skibbity, and maybe yeet. Leave me a comment if I'm leaving any out. The point of this video is not to beat up on Gen Alpha, because picking on kids really isn't a good look. Maybe we shouldn't be propping up teenagers and children as arbiters of culture and asking them to explain a language to us when they're still kind of learning that language. And honestly, every generation does this. The baby boomers think they invented groovy. So we've seen that slang can come from honest-to-goodness new words, but also misunderstanding, borrowing, truncation, and just simply giving a word more recognition as slang even when it's not new. Not to mention changing the part of speech. Let's go through the top Google hits for Gen Alpha slang and see it in action. First, the second Google hit because it's just a top 10. Skibbity. It's a made-up word that you don't need to know the origin story of because it's complicated and boring. Its meaning is not yet actually consistent, so it's more of a generational marker. My professional opinion is that you will not need to worry about this one because it will be cringe extremely soon. Rizz is a truncation of charisma. That's it. Phantom tax. Everyone will tell you it's grabbing someone else's food and is named after a streamer, Phantom, but nobody seems to get the pun that it's a phantom tax, which is a phrase that has existed for a while. What can I say? People who write slang explainers are usually not very good at lexicography. Yeah, you'll be told that this is an acronym for girl your ass is thick, which, like, maybe, but it's about as likely as fat being an acronym for pretty hot and tempting. It's originally from borrowing gawd, as in, God damn! The thing you say when a shorty is fat if you're a millennial. Ratioed. This is 100% from Twitter and primarily used by Gen X and millennials. Cap. This is a lie. Its origin should be transparent to people, but evidently isn't. It's a facade. Literally, a cap is a false front, like on teeth. Cap is literally the next iteration of fronting. Goated. This is actually from an initialism, which is rare. Greatest of all time. It's now changed part of speech to past participle, which means expect back formations soon. Big yikes. Yikes goes back to the boomers, and I have no idea why people think Gen Alpha invented it. Gen Alpha is skibbity, yikes is Scooby. Sigma male, I already explained this one. And now let's go through the #1 Google result, an explainer written by the delightfully named Febriana Ramadania, something that only happens once every 33 years. I had to look that one up. 8. This is to do something well. The origin is to do it thoroughly, and to my knowledge, this comes from gay black ballroom culture in New York in the 80s, as a lot of these will. Basic. Conforming to mainstream trends. In the 90s, in Black English, and to my knowledge, this is still the case, it has the additional meaning of stupid. Deeply ironic that people who were called basic missed what they were actually being called and self-identify as such. This is also not at all new to Gen Alpha. Notice how this works by analogy, though. Basic is roughly equivalent to remedial. You're basic while everyone else has moved on to advanced things. Bet. Transparently from you bet. Black folks did this first by at least a decade and then it spread. Big W, do I really need to explain this? Bop, a catchy or enjoyable song. This goes back to at least the 1940s in Black English. Bussin', this is from busting, like bursting. You just no longer have to say with flavor or whatever. This is one of those instances where a person's accent, their dialect, gets reinterpreted as being a new and fun word, just like bay. Cap, we already did that. Chuggy, this one I actually think they made up. Good job, Gen Z. Clout. The author is confused, and this has been around for almost 100 years. It's originally from a word that meant to whack something. Cringe. This is now an adjective and not a verb, but that's literally the only difference. Most likely it's a shortening of cringe-inducing, which was popular about 20 years ago. Delulu. That's delusional with cuckoo loco reduplication. Redupu. Drip. Surely you remember this. Extra. Over the top. Literally exactly what it sounds like. Instead of saying he's extra wild today, you can just leave off the descriptor for a vague sense of doing too much. Too much what? Just too much. Also via Black English, where it started as slang and has been around for a long time. Facts. Another instance of mistaking an accent for a new word. It's facts. A general expression of agreement as in what you are saying are facts. Finna. This is not slang at all, but a future modal in quite a few varieties of English, originally from fixing oneself to do something. It's not originally from Black English to my knowledge, but it is prevalent among Black English speakers in both the US South, where it originated, and the North, where it's marked as being primarily Black, but that's changing. It's primarily Southern, though. It's just the Great Migration coming into play here. Fire. Another part of speech jump, so now it's an adjective, meaning good. Flex. Another part of speech jump, as I explained above. Glow up. This is a makeover. In French, they have the imagined English word re-looking. It's like that. Gucci. Sounds vaguely evocative of good and is a luxury brand. I'm surprised this didn't happen earlier. Ghost. Historically, this was to leave. Think the little cloud in the shape of a character that just ran off in a Warner Brothers cartoon. But it was borrowed into the mainstream from, you guessed it, Black English, where it now means, in the mainstream, to stop responding or to stand someone up. Ick. This was used by Cab Calloway in the 1930s. Why are we attributing it to Gen Alpha? It's the golden generation or whatever. The lost generation? You're literally 100 years late on this. It's giving. I have no idea why it's hard for people to recognize that this means exuding and literally the same as giving off, but without the preposition off. Lit. How do you get something that's fire? This is by analogy with starting something like a firework or an engine. It goes. Low key. I mentioned this earlier, and it originated with music, at least according to Etymology Online, although I always thought it had to do with keying as in lighting contrast in film. Low vibrational, bringing down the energy. This is just physics used as a metaphor, although it does seem popular in particular among hoteps for whom vibration is more of a spiritual thing. Mid. This is the euphemism treadmill at work. Eventually good and bad will be sigma and good. Mood. This is a single statement in response to something. To my knowledge, it originated with Gen X and was used to death by millennials. It's a response as though you are captioning whatever you're looking at or describing. As in, this is a picture of my mood. Peep. Are you kidding me? Again, it's Cab Calloway. At this point, I should make a video about slang from the 1930s. Jeepers creepers. Where'd you get those peepers? Period. This is something that boomers used to indicate finality in whatever they're proclaiming. The one with the T, period, is just a way of representing an accent. I have an entire publication on what's going on there called Tweets as Graffiti, where I compare Black Twitter and graffiti at Pompeii. If anyone's interested in that, I'll leave a link below. That's on period is a version of this that uses a uniquely Black American grammatical structure. It's kind of slang, but also the same idea. Charisma. Enough said. Salty, also not new. Pretty sure Melville used this. Sheesh. This is where the fact that these lists are not always made by native English speakers really shows. This is, again, the recency illusion, and this is a taboo deformation of G's, from Jesus, from the 1950s. For taboo deformations, definitely check out last week's video. Shook. This is literally the same as shaken with exactly the same meaning. It's the participle and it's just being borrowed from other dialects. Go ahead and guess which one gave us shook and woke and turnt. Shooketh. This is a playful variant, and the ending is one that comes from the fact that literally nobody seems to understand the basics of Middle English anymore. It's a pet peeve of mine for a different day. Slay. I already murked this. Sleeper. Also very, very old. It's dark horse. Snack. A snack is something that looks so good you can gobble it up. Now apply that to people. It's what my grandmother would have called a dish, but I guess you don't get as much anymore on account of inflation. Snatched, looking good, originally from snatching wigs from Black gay ballroom culture, so like 1980s New York. Squad, I already explained this one to my unit. By the way, expect replacements like unit, team, etc. in coming years. Stan, an obsessed fan, which is itself short for fanatic. Sus, a truncation of suspicious. This has somehow become perceived as slang when I definitely learned it as just a regular word in the 90s and had the impression that it was used that way as far back as at least the 1960s. T, gossip, from a respelling of the letter T for truth, at least apocryphally, from ballroom culture. Thirsty, eager, needy, pressed. This one should be obvious. You want something. It's a physical metaphor. Vibe and its variations all have to do with good vibrations. Woke, I have a whole video on this, but it's like shook in that it's literally just the participle awake, just borrowed from Black English. So now the mainstream has awake and woke with different meanings when woke was just awake, being used metaphorically. Yeet, an onomatopoeia used to express excitement or when throwing something. By the way, I spelled onomatopoeia correctly the first time in writing my script, so like A+ for me. Anyway, my understanding is that yeet originated with video games, along with things like NPC, that's non-player character, and a handful of other terms. Having gone through the top Gen Alpha slang according to Google, there's a few things that should stand out. First, most of it isn't Gen Alpha. Second, the overwhelming majority of slang items can be figured out if you use context clues, but also there's ironically a danger there because these things sometimes become slang because people used context clues and got it almost, but not quite right. So yeah, Gen Alpha slang is kind of stupid, but that's okay. That's how slang happens. It's either misunderstandings or changing parts of speech or intentionally obfuscating, but that's what makes it fun. Its novelty tickles our brains, and then it gets really old really fast and we just stop saying it. Or it becomes so mainstream that we don't think of it as slang anymore, like fan or cool. If you like this video, please like and subscribe and leave me a comment with anything I left out or with your favorite slang. Bonus points if you invent plausibly Gen Alpha slang that's not real. Like that one guy. Thanks to all my patrons. You can become one at patreon.com/languagejones, or you can support the channel right here with super thanks and super chat. If you liked this video, YouTube thinks that you'll like this one, and it's their business to know these things. Until next time, don't be a Murgatroyd Jeff, Daddy-o.